Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Saturday, everybody. I hope you're enjoying a restful weekend. Today's video will discuss US, EU, China developments from this week with a focus on Beijing's priority to prevent EU alignment with the United States in its trade policy towards China. I think this is currently the most important geopolitical story in the world, as it involves the majority of global economic output, over 40% of global trade, and the dynamics fueling fragmentation of the global order towards a system of blocks, greatly exacerbating geopolitical fault lines and increasing the risks of kinetic conflict. As US-based Bloomberg observed yesterday, quote, "The world's 3 dominant economies are entering a new combative phase as the US increasingly uses trade weapons borrowed from China's playbook. That's threatening to deepen international fractures and to challenge decades of free market orthodoxy." End quote. Regular viewers know that trade and technology tensions have become front and center in both EU and US, as well as others, in recent months, with accusations of overcapacity made against Beijing, accusations which the PRC has forcefully rejected. This episode is quite quote-heavy, but I believe it's incredibly important to examine at length what key decision-makers are saying. And of course, this is a channel of analysis, not entertainment, so I'm sure most viewers will understand. Last week, Biden introduced a slew of new tariffs on Chinese goods. While only affecting approximately 5% of imported goods, they were targeted at key strategic areas. We have discussed these and their implications at length in previous episodes. The EU has several ongoing probes into Chinese imports, which we have also discussed. This week, US Treasury Secretary Yellen was in the EU to persuade the Europeans to work with the US to address PRC industrial overcapacity. In Frankfurt on Tuesday, Yellen said the US and its Western allies must react in a united way to China's growing manufacturing power or put their own industries at risk. Quote, "As I've repeatedly emphasized, we do not seek to decouple, we seek to diversify. Our critical mineral supply chains are currently over-concentrated in China. We saw the danger of over-reliance during the COVID pandemic and in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion. We have also engaged directly with China on areas where the US and Europe, along with many others, are concerned by China's actions, from its pursuit of economic coercion to macroeconomic imbalances that are leading to industrial overcapacity. Industrial overcapacity not only poses a threat to firms in the US and Europe, it could also prevent countries around the world, including emerging markets, from building the industries that could power their growth." End quote. However, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had already said it would not join the US in imposing levies, adding that Brussels would take a different approach to Washington's, quote, "blanket tariffs," end quote, expressing a few hours before the Yellen speech, quote, "We want competition, we want to trade together, but we want it to be fair and by the rules." End quote. Yet Beijing is very concerned that other G7 countries will follow the US in enacting measures against what they see as overcapacity and trade abuses. On Wednesday, the PRC Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Wang Wenbin's comments signaled these worries, expressing, quote, "Overcapacity is just a pretext for the US to try to coerce G7 members into creating fences and restrictions for Chinese new energy products. This could mean building a coalition for protectionism, which is completely against the trend of the times." End quote. State media has been publishing several articles every day, almost, pushing back against overcapacity accusations. To give a few examples from this week, party mouthpiece The People's Daily expressed on Tuesday, quote, "The US tariff increase is a typical act of hegemony and bullying. To maintain their unipolar hegemony, they see China's development as a threat and suppress China by any means, to the point of near irrationality. The US's relentless suppression of the development of Chinese industries does not prove US strength, but exposes a loss of confidence and composure." End quote. The Vice President and Professor at the School of Economics at Peking University, as well as the Assistant Researcher at the Center for European Economic and Strategic Studies at Peking University, jointly penned a piece in the same outlet on Wednesday, expressing, quote, Recently, in Western media, there has been a wave of discussions about China's overcapacity in new energy sectors, disparaging China's practice of providing high-quality, low-cost products to the world as dumping, disrupting global prices, and distorting markets. These discussions erroneously claim that China's new energy overcapacity threatens the industrial development of other countries and impacts the global economy. Such claims are economically unsound and factually incorrect, serving as pretexts for trade protectionist measures against Chinese new energy products. This politicization and securitization of economic issues masks an intent to suppress China's industrial development, aiming to secure a more advantageous competitive position and market benefits for their own countries. The clamor over the China overcapacity theory reveals the double standards of the US and Western countries in international economic and trade relations. End quote. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing all helps for the channel. And for anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is a lot of work, but all your support are all incredible sources of motivation. So thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Of course, it's no surprise that Beijing is concerned about a united Western trade bloc against China. Such a bloc imposing measures to counter Chinese industrial policy would cost tens of millions of jobs in China and threaten Beijing's ambitious goals to climb the value chain. But while it's perfectly understandable to see why China would want to dominate the most advanced industries, it's just as perfectly understandable to see why the US, the EU, Japan and others would want to maintain their positions in those industries. At the end of yesterday's episode, we quoted Peking University professor of finance Michael Pettis as expressing, quote, "Beijing should indeed implement trade and industrial policies designed to give it comparative advantage in strategically important sectors, and foreign governments cannot complain as long as it doesn't result in any larger trade surpluses. But of course, this works both ways. No one can legitimately complain if the US, the EU, Japan or others also decide that these sectors are strategically important and so aggressively implement trade and industrial policies designed to protect or regain comparative advantage." End quote. It's also no surprise that rising industrial support would inevitably result in a protectionist backlash. According to research group Global Trade Alert, almost 70% of global exports, worth $14.1 trillion, compete with subsidized rivals, up from almost 50% a decade ago. Beijing has weaponized its large market many times in the past, so it knows very well how bitter a pill it can be to swallow for those on the receiving end. This week, the G7 finance ministers met in northern Italy, and the leaders are scheduled to meet next month. UK-based Reuters reports that the French finance minister said on Wednesday that, quote, "In the face of this overcapacity, it is vital that the G7 and Europe stand united. Europe must affirm its economic power." End quote. The political tide does appear to be moving towards protectionist measures. In a piece published on Thursday called "How Germany Lost the Battle to Prevent Tariffs on Chinese Cars," US-based outlet Politico wrote that the European Commission is expected to impose preliminary anti-subsidy duties on Chinese EVs by early July, but rules require the EU to already communicate such a decision to car makers and other parties like EU importers of Chinese cars 4 weeks in advance, meaning that the announcement of the upcoming tariffs is expected to land in about 2 weeks. Quote, "The recent quadrupling of US tariffs on Chinese EVs, which amplifies the pressure on Europe, as it is one of the few major markets that remains open to Chinese car imports, only augments the likelihood of the EU also taking action." End quote. Reinhard Hoben, the economic policy spokesperson of the Free Democratic Party, FDP, which governs in Germany's coalition, expressed to the outlet, quote, "The pressure on Europe will grow as a result of the Biden administration's decision. We must not tolerate unfair subsidy practices by the People's Republic of China. The investigation by the European Commission is, therefore, the right thing to do and must now be brought to a careful but also swift conclusion." End quote. US Treasury Secretary Yellen also spoke at the G7 finance meeting, where she called for a, quote, "wall of opposition," end quote, to PRC industrial practices, expressing, quote, "So long as Putin continues to wage war, more action is needed. The US will continue to press firms and financial institutions in China and other countries to cease their support for Russia's military-industrial base, such as through supplying key inputs like optics and semiconductors, end quote, adding, quote, finally, we'll be focused here on China's industrial overcapacity. As I've communicated directly to my Chinese counterparts, China's macroeconomic imbalances are being aggravated by Chinese direct and indirect government support to the manufacturing sector. This is currently leading to production in some industries that significantly exceeds not only China's domestic demand, but also what the global market can bear. Without a new policy direction, including to lift Chinese demand instead of just boosting supply, this can lead to large volumes of exports at depressed prices. The G7 has collectively recognized the need to protect our workers and businesses from unfair practices. And overcapacity threatens the viability of firms around the world, including in emerging markets. I believe it also poses a challenge to China's growth. End quote. Chinese officials and state media have done what they can to push back, employing the usual tactic of arguing that if the EU follows suit with the US, they are acting like a puppet. With the state-run Global Times writing on Thursday, quote, the EU currently faces choices, whether to follow the US in taking unified actions against China or to maintain the EU's strategic autonomy, end quote. And of course, it is threatening retaliation against European products and firms. While the EU has a huge trade deficit with China, meaning collectively China is much more vulnerable to a trade war, several specific European sectors are vulnerable, some of which, like German car makers, are politically influential. At a press briefing on Thursday, a PRC Ministry of Commerce spokesperson was asked whether he could confirm a media report China is considering raising the temporary tariff rate on imported cars with engines larger than 2.5 litres, and if such a move is a retaliation against the moves by the EU and the US. The spokesperson did not offer a direct response. The PRC has also signalled to the EU this week that if it does not back off from its subsidy investigations, then wine, cheese and aircraft exports might run into some problems. These are also politically influential industries within Europe. The Chinese Chamber of Commerce to the EU echoed the warning this week, saying that, quote, European wine and dairy products may find themselves caught in the crossfire, end quote. On Thursday, Peking University professor of finance Michael Pettis expressed, quote, the EU is in a tough position politically. The benefits of protecting its manufacturing sectors will come at the cost of hurting specific sectors that export to China. This means that the costs are likely to be concentrated while the benefits spread out, end quote. To repeat the observation made at the beginning of today's video, the world's three dominant economies are entering a new combative phase that's threatening to deepen international fractures and challenge decades of free market orthodoxy. And it leaves Europe with big decisions to make. In the coming months, these decisions and the resulting geopolitical shifts will begin to take shape. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Have a lovely Saturday, have a great and restful weekend, and I will see you on Monday.